Well, there are a few people who knew more about UFC and MMA than my next guest, Chuck Mindenhall. Chuck, thanks so much for taking the time. I know you've got a lot of stuff going on and there's a big weekend ahead. So tell me first off what you guys are doing with The Ringer on Friday night for MMA and UFC fans who might be interested in even attending this thing.
So it's a big event if the Ringer crew is going to show up for a live event. We've never done one of these before where we do a live taping before a big event. So the Friday night before UFC 281, we will be at the Hillside Barbecue. You just looked it up for me. I'm sorry. It was, is that correct?
Hill Country Barbecue, 7 p.m. Yes. And I guess you can get tickets at hillcountry.com/ringer if they want to attend this in person. I imagine for somebody that's been doing this a long time, like you have, and who's in a bunch of different things, the chance to actually go live and be with the fans and record a podcast like this is probably pretty fun.
It is fun. And I've attended these types of things my whole life, and I've done a couple of live things, but I have not really done a live taping. But this one's kind of special, too, because it's catering to the audience. We have an interactive show, a lot of loyal fans, but we also have Anthony Smith and Laura Sanko and Merab Vijvile will all be there to help us do a Q&A. We have giveaways, all that good stuff, meet and greet. So I think it's just more of like a celebration of getting the community together and having like an event together before the big event. So I look forward to it, and I think it's going to be a good turnout.
Very cool. And if anybody is around and they want to attend, certainly encourage you guys to go to the website and check it out, pick up some tickets and meet you in person. But, the people's main event, as it's being dubbed, between Dustin Poirier and Michael Chandler is one that is interesting. Some history between these two, I think, but stylistically, does this have the potential to maybe be the fight of the night when you analyze these two fighters?
I think it would be disappointing if it wasn't the fight of the night, to be honest with you. It's just one of those types of fights that you look where the guys are in their trajectories. You look at kind of both carrying a chip on their shoulder. They're very nice guys. They get along with just about everybody but, each other. They don't like each other. They have a chip on their shoulder over the way certain things have been handled in the UFC over the years. They've been at it a long time. I just think that you put all that together and where they're at in their career, what they're looking to achieve, it just adds up to fireworks, especially when you look back to their last couple of fights. With Michael Chandler, he's been in some just all out and out wars over the last year and a half, ever since coming to the UFC, essentially. And then Dustin Poirier, I think, is at that point of his career, too, where the title and stuff means a little less maybe than just going out there and putting on a show. Madison Square Garden. I know that people are buzzing about this, so I would be surprised, honestly, if this just wasn't like the fight of the night or the fight of the year, really. I think it has that kind of potential.
Chandler being billed as an underdog in this one, what does he need to do well?
I think if he uses his wrestling, it's a weird one because I always think that Michael Chandler has in his back pocket, whether he uses them or not is always a different story, but he has very good wrestling, collegiate wrestler at Mizzou. I know he knows how to control the octagon. He can nullify other guys' strengths. I think he could do that with Poirier here if he just wants to do that. But if he wants to get into a gunfight, he's still capable of doing that. But I think his best path to victory would be to incorporate his wrestling and then try to dictate the tempo a little bit.
And for Poirier, he's never lost consecutive fights before, but coming off a pretty significant layoff here. When you are away from the cage and then you get back in, could that potentially be one of these X factors that would even up this fight and actually surprise some people?
He's one of those guys that I think obsesses over remaining in shape, and I think he's got that edge to him. I would be less worried about that. I also think he's a guy who's fairly young in this game, who's been through so many different big scenarios, including the Conor McGregor series that just happened. Maybe a little time away from that spotlight serves him right, and I think honestly, I don't really anticipate like ring rust or cage rust or any of that sort of thing being a problem for a guy like that. He just carries too much of a competitive edge with him everywhere he goes. Like he has his own line of hot sauce and stuff like that. He's a business guy. Everything he does, he competes, right? So I just feel like going into a fight like this with a guy that he has the bad blood with, he'll be in his vintage form, I think, come Saturday night.
And for what the outcome potentially means for his future, if he can beat Chandler emphatically, do you think that would convince him to go for another title shot?
I think he would like that. And it's a good hurdle, right? Like if he's able to get through somebody high up in the rankings like this, I think Chandler's very well respected. They're both always hovering in title contention anyway. I think it makes his case. And I think the UFC likes him. You know what I mean? There are certain guys, the styles or whatever, they may not favor them because to be frank, they probably don't want to have a future where there's a champion they can't market as well. But when you get to guys like this, Poirier and Chandler, I mean, they're both so marketable. So I would think so, yeah. I think that he gets over this hurdle, and I would be surprised if he's not saying something along those lines in his post-fight speech.
You mentioned Chandler's wrestling style, or all these different kind of tools that he has in his toolkit that sometimes he uses and sometimes he doesn't. What is it about Dustin Poirier's style that complements that could maybe lend the advantage to Dustin coming into a matchup like this?
Dustin is all about pace and pressure and pace, and like I think that he gets into a flow, I think, in his fights with his striking, and he mixes it up so well. I just think that if Chandler's able to kind of incorporate what he's trying to do, if he's able to kind of slow the fight, maybe make it a little ugly. And I know this is it's funny because, right, it's being billed as like the people's main event. So how ugly do you want to make it entertaining? And it's really the priorities in this fight. But I just think that Dustin Poirier will push that pace. He's going to want to have that kind of fight. Chandler has the ability to make it uglier, and I think that's his path to victory. So I think he can do that if he chooses.
Why is this fight so attractive for fight fans?
I think it's just the history. Michael Chandler in 2011, Michael Chandler had a fight of the year that people still talk about against Eddie Alvarez. And he's been in several others that are they're just big fights. Dustin Poirier's had some big fights, like big action fights where they're getting bonus checks at the end. I just think that, like sometimes one guy's going to accommodate the other, and it just makes for a very combustible situation where you're like, these guys are going to go in there and swing. And plus, being Madison Square Garden, I think these guys relish the spotlight and that swing bout on a big pay-per-view like this. Madison Square Garden, they want to deliver. It just has all the writing on the wall. And that's why I say, like, I would actually be surprised if it's not some kind of like fight. It would have to be a fluky thing, and I'll knock on wood so that doesn't happen, but something would have to happen to one of them where it wouldn't be back and forth and you'd get like plot twists within the fights. I think it's going to be one of those kind of fights.
Is Madison Square Garden the most attractive venue, certainly the most iconic for the history that it has with boxing and other sports, along this vein? Is it the most attractive venue for some of these UFC fighters to just go there and kind of make their stamp there and validate, their sport in some ways, I think?
I think because there are a couple of reasons. One, New York for the longest time kept MMA out. It was not sanctioned there for a long time. And I mean, I was literally the last state to regulate MMA and to sanction it. So there was already a threshold just to be in New York. It still feels like there's a little bit of exhilaration about being in New York for the UFC. A couple of big events they've had there already where they've had big time nights where crazy things have happened. I think though, that most of these guys are old enough where they kind of grew up watching boxing, or they were watching, that type of thing. And a lot of the big fights, Roy, you could go backwards any way you want to, as far as you want to, at Madison Square Garden. And it's that hallowed ground feel, right? Like where you're just at the Mecca, you're going into a situation where so much history has taken place. I think a lot of guys really feel that. And the UFC does a very good job of promoting that on all of their promo material. They basically point out that history a lot. They kind of tie it into the boxing angle. So I think it does. Like Vegas is kind of a fight hub, and then they have Abu Dhabi, and they've got some places where they're getting there. But I think if you looked at what existed before MMA and what still stands, it's New York, right? It's got to be Madison Square Garden. Those guys are excited about competing there.
How do you see the main event sort of shaking out? Kind of break down this matchup for us, and who you think has the edge?
It's a great main event. There's a history between these two guys with Alex Pereira and Izzy Adesanya. It's an interesting one in the sense that you could say that each guy is only there because of the other. Alex Pereira, like he has a couple of victories against Izzy Adesanya, who hasn't really lost at 185 in MMA yet. Like he's undefeated at 185 pounds. The only loss he has is when he went up to try to fight at 205. So his invincibility factor is still there. He still has that it factor. I think that the way he fights, is just so smart, so cunning. He's a sniper. He's a showman. He's all those things. But then you're talking about a guy who has been his kryptonite and beat him at the arena that he's best at, which is kickboxing. he beat him twice in Glory Kickboxing. And I think that backstory just makes, first of all, for a very good psychological interplay between the two. We've never seen Israel Adesanya come into a situation where I think the doubt was this big. And we've never seen him go against a guy who could be potentially better than him at the thing he's best at, which is kickboxing, using the range, using the cage, cutting off angles, all those things. It just makes for a fascinating fight. And honestly, it's very difficult to call. It's like, how do you really look at this? The MMA experience goes to Izzy Adesanya, but the psychological edge goes the other way. So it's one of those 50-50 fights, and I love it when we get these kind of fights in the UFC.
From what you know about Adesanya, having those previous losses, having this history dating back to his days as a kickboxer, do you ultimately think that psychological sort of narrative will come into play and affect him?
He says it doesn't. And honestly, what we know about Israel Adesanya is that he's a very cerebral fighter as well. Very big picture. I think he's one of those guys who envisions scenarios and makes them come to pass. You know what I mean? Like, he's one of those guys who takes it that serious. I don't think he gets complacent with victories. I think he trains as hard all the time. Having said all of that, I do get the sense that this is one guy he was sort of not wanting to talk about for a long time. And it may be a guy that I think it's only human nature. If somebody has beat you and especially knocked you out and maybe took you off your moorings of how you normally fight, I think that you would be concerned that could repeat itself. So I think there is a psychological factor there, but if anybody's going to overcome that, it's a guy who fights that cerebrally and actually really builds his own confidence. I mean, really, really does a good job of psyching himself up for a fight. He just doesn't balk under the spotlights. When he gets under spotlights, I feel like he performs. Sometimes they're not as, they're not as entertaining of fights as people expect, but he's always on. You know what I mean? I haven't seen him yet where he's just not showing up mentally or physically. He's just not there. So I expect the best version of it. But there's still that asterisk, that tiny asterisk where you're like, he could be affected. Something could go south and you see him fold. That's in play. These types of things are in play for this fight.
You mentioned him sort of being a gamer and rising to the occasion, and he has been nearly untouchable since joining UFC in 2017. He's known as one of the best strikers in UFC. I mean, is there something that you can point to that was a turning point that clicked for him mentally, or has he always been that way? And since he joined UFC in 2017, you've just seen that consistency factor of him showing up in the biggest moments and executing. It's
kind of interesting with him because he came in about 4 years, a little over 4 years ago, and he had a good performance. And he was a very raw fighter. He speaks his mind. He can be very crude. I think he was even hiking like he was marking his territory in his first UFC fight. He can be a little bit like this. He came in mostly as a showman, not mostly. He was known for being a kickboxer, a champion, but at the same time, he was a showman as well. It feels to me like when he went up and he fought for the 205-pound belt, and that didn't go his way. It's his only loss in MMA so far, that he dialed it back a little. Now, he's still coming out to choreograph dancing, and he's got these big entrances and stuff, which kind of leads you to believe in the anticipation, the hype. It leads you to believe he's going to be that showman. But realistically, he's fought a lot more conservatively, a lot more counter-striking, a lot more safe, in the last couple of fights. And I wonder if that altered him a little bit to keep his reign going. But this type of fight, I wonder if this brings out that dog to the original guy, the guy who was, beating Derek Brunson the way he did and, schooling on Anderson Silva. I'm kind of wondering if this will be the opponent that drags that back out of him and we see the exciting vintage form of Izzy coming back.
And you have that sort of juxtaposed by what Pereira's been through. It seems like it's been a meteoric rise. I mean, just a couple of short years, and he's got a title shot. I mean, to what do you attribute that success?
I think his big success is the backstory, right? Like, he's coming from Glory, and he was the guy who actually beat Israel Adesanya. So if you ever heard his name before he was really rolling in MMA, it was always associated to this guy who had beat him, who's now stepping into mixed martial arts. Well, he's only had 4 fights since 2020. As he's basically committed himself fully to MMA. And with each victory, I feel like his footsteps got a little louder. And it's like, okay, here he comes. If he keeps doing this, if we get this and this and this, soon we'll have that fight again if Israel Adesanya is still the champion. Well, it worked out. He got through Sean Strickland. And I mean, what Sean Strickland was thinking to stand with him and get knocked out like that is another story. But he was able to get through Sean Strickland and with flying colors. And that set the table for this. And I just think that it helps him to have that backstory. The fact that these two guys have that history together is what expedited him to this position. If they had never faced each other, as quiet as Alex Pereira is, and he doesn't speak English, things like that, he's not the biggest hype machine. I feel like he's not trying to hype anything up. I'm pretty sure he would not be in this position, but it's just the fact that he has done the inconceivable already, and that just adds to the dimension of a big fight. So that's why he's here.
The backstory is so rich. Their different personalities makes it so much more interesting too. I think even for like an outside fan that just loves a good storyline heading into a fight like this, who do you give the edge to right now between the two?
I'll tell you what, and I'm a little biased because I live in Western Connecticut, and that is where Alex Pereira is. He's based like 5 minutes from where I'm at. So I went and visited him this last week, and he just strikes me as the guy where hype goes to die. You know, like he doesn't buy into the mystique of what Israel Adesanya brings to the table. Some of these guys are a little bit, they kind of cower to the spotlight a little bit, and then maybe Israel Adesanya just being a star who he is, he handles the camera so well. You think that they're kind of beat before they get in there with him a little bit. I just don't get any sense of that. I think that he believes that he's the superior fighter, regardless if he's in his head or not. I just think Alex believes he's the better fighter. And I think he's also just really deadly on the feet. You know, he's just so good at engaging. So I'm giving, and it's kind of crazy for me to say this because I don't pick against Israel Adesanya very often, but I'm giving right now, just off the top of my head, like envisioning this fight, the advantage to the underdog in this fight, which is Alex Pereira. I think he's going to bring the fight, and I think that slight psychological edge will play in his favor.
Wow. I mean, that's pretty exciting for fans to think about, that it could deliver, right? I mean, to have a main event like this that would deliver with two guys who are so accomplished in their own right, going toe to toe with a fantastic backstory is exciting. How much of this sport, especially when you enter a main event, sort of huge stage like this in a big venue, how much of this is going to be mental and how much of it's going to be physical?
I think the mental part of it is big. And sometimes it's kind of crazy because some guys are built for the spotlight. I was mentioning this with Israel Adesanya. I just believe that the bigger the spotlight, the more he feels at home. So I feel like he's going to handle himself just fine. It's really the psychological interplay between the others. Will Alex Pereira, who's never been anywhere near an event this big, be the guy who kind of gets drawn in the end? I don't get that sense from him, but you never know sometimes until they make those walkouts. And especially say that the place is rocking, and this has happened there before where there's an escalation point of the fights, the way they're going, where you get a fight of the year type thing, and then there's another fight that's delivering, then you get to your main event, and it's whipped into a frenzy. And if that's the case, if I was going to say that the situation or the circumstance might affect somebody, I would have to point to maybe Alex Pereira, who's just never been there. I think the gravity of that moment may sneak in a little bit and be like, whoa, how did I get here? This is crazy, because it did happen so fast for him. But I wouldn't bank on that. And I think he's one of those guys who, he came from very meager beginnings and had to fight his way to get here. I think he's a fairly well-grounded guy. So I'm guessing if anybody's affected, it's him, but if I was to bet on it, I'd be I think both guys handled themselves just fine in that spotlight.
What are you looking forward to, Chuck, on the women's side? Some people who aren't, as deeply involved in the sport as you are, novice fans who would just come to an attractive main event like this, might know the name Carla Esparza, but what do you? Yeah, I mean, maybe not. What are you looking forward to on the women's side? Are there quality fights over there that are going to deliver as well?
Yeah, I mean that strawweight title fight is a good one. It's not the sexiest one they've done in terms of the marquee names, because they've had Rose Namajunas, I think, was one of the more popular champions, who Carla Esparza beat in a very lackluster kind of performance, right? So you get a Carla Esparza who's her second stint, I should say, as a champion. The first time she lost to Joanna Jędrzejczyk. This time she's fighting in Madison Square Garden, which is a big deal, and she's going against somebody who I think the UFC is putting in this spot because they prefer, honestly, they'd probably prefer to have Weili Zhang as the champion again. Just the China as a market, and when Weili was the champion, I know that was blowing up. The brand was blowing up. She was a popular champion. Carla's I don't want to call her a placeholder, but she's holding that belt, and I think this is a big moment for her because she lost it fairly anticlimactically the last time. And this time she's riding into it almost like as a heel champion, because she barely beats a popular champion in Rose Namajunas, a split decision. There wasn't a lot of action. 3 of her last 4 fights have been split decisions. I think it's a lot of pressure on her to deliver. I think it's going to be her fight. She can definitely make it. If she fights her fight, it's usually a non-exciting, dictate the tempo, nullify offense type of performance. She can certainly do that, but I'm not sure it would win her any fans. So this one is kind of fascinating in and how Carla approaches this whole thing.
So it's not surprising to you then that the champion in this scenario is actually the underdog coming into this fight when you consider everything?
I don't think it's not surprising, and it's really the musical chairs aspect of what's going on in that division. Nobody's holding the title too long, and it seems like it's kind of set up a little bit for Weili to go in there and showcase. This is not an easy fight by any stretch, but I do think that she has kind of the stylistic matchup. Like she hits so hard, and she's very sturdy. So it's very difficult to move her around or to throw her down to the canvas, things like that. I think that she'll be able to keep the fight where she wants it, and we'll be able to make good. It remains to be seen, but I do think that this is a matchup that benefits her in this situation, yeah.
And how much of that Weili Zhang being, in a position to potentially win this fight has to do with her training, her commitment to training?
A lot of it. I think that she takes it very seriously. I remember talking to her on one of her trips. I believe she was fighting. Well, she was either in New York or she was fighting in New York, but it was the last time through, and I was able to talk to her, and just talking to her camp, and every one of them basically was, talking about her commitment, dedication, just the things she's inspired by, like to just get in there and work hard and to push herself. So I never will question that on her side at all. I think that she has the heart of a champion. I think that the UFC sees this too, and I still feel like they didn't get enough of the era to satisfy that, because I think that she could open up chapters in the way that Ronda Rousey might have back when she was the champion. It was kind of all of a sudden you had a lot of judo enrollment and young girls who were getting into fighting, wrestling, all those types of things. I think that that's kind of what happens with Weili Zhang with China, right? Like if you're able to market her properly, she becomes this galvanizing force for the MMA scene over there. So I think that that's what they're looking at, and I think she does have the tools to kind of become that too.
Chuck, before I let you go, just what are you personally most excited about heading towards the weekend?
I think that you mentioned that Chandler fight. It's hard not to be excited for that one, just because of what we detailed before. That swing bout, for whatever reason, has always been that it's basically the middle of the card, like right in the middle of the pay-per-view. It always kind of has like a fight like this, a fascination, or a good pay-per-view usually has a bang for your buck fight. To me, that one just has all of it. And again, I think that both guys are hovering in title, like they're hovering around the title shot. Like if whoever puts on the show, whoever gets through this will be a player again, and how they're going to have to get there is going to have to be through hell. And I mean, as a spectator, what more are you asking for? 2 guys who just refuse to lose going at it on a big pay-per-view like that. I just think that one's going to deliver. Yeah.
Absolutely does not get better than that. Chuck Mindenhall, thanks so much for being with us. Enjoy the weekend. Enjoy the live podcast. Hopefully everybody can get out in New York City and check you guys out live on The Ringer. Appreciate your time.
Thank you. Appreciate it.